Hello everyone, a warm welcome to episode 3 of our Military 101 Explainer series. And today we have an interesting topic to cover, which is the structure of our Indian Armed Forces. And always thank you, Sohraab, for joining us and hopefully answering a few more questions for us today.
Thank you.
So Sohraab, let's start with the basic question. Can you please explain how the armed forces are broadly structured?
Yeah, of course. So, as far as the Indian Army is concerned, which we are mainly covering today, because in the Indian Army, the units and formations are much more important
Correct.
to the organization as compared to the Navy and Air Force, where the formations are at a much higher echelon of command.
Correct.
So, of course, these are very important to the structure of an armed force, any armed force across the world. You need organization in order to carry out any sort of operation, whether that be in combat or even humanitarian operations.
Absolutely.
It's very important. So, of course, that's where the concept of organization comes from. These organization structures have evolved over time to become very intricate.
Correct.
And a lot of types have been removed, a lot of types have been added. The most fundamental component of the Indian Army is the unit, of course. And these units are grouped together to form formations. The unit term is usually used to refer to battalions.
Okay.
And of course, they're known as many other terms. They're referred to with many other terms in other arms of the Indian Army. But the battalion is usually you are referred to as the unit.
Okay.
Of course, there are smaller units and multiple battalions grouped together make formations.
Correct.
And that's the basic difference. People often misconstrue formations above battalions as units, but that's an incorrect usage of the term unit. Any organization below the size of a battalion is also referred to as a unit.
Okay.
But anything above the size of a battalion will always be referred to as a formation, at least in the Indian context. So the smallest unit that we start with is called the fire team.
Okay.
It's informal, it's not used everywhere. It's more of an obscure term.
Okay.
It usually consists of 1 to 4 soldiers. And
pretty small.
Yeah. So it's kind of informal. It's more formally used in the US military or any military that's more oriented towards NCOs or a bottom-up bottom-up organization. So that's where fire teams come from, and they're used to execute various maneuvers, and they're quite useful. But they're
also very agile because they're
exactly. And they're usually used to execute a certain role. So like in a military, in the military engineers, maybe as explosives, ordnance disposal, or in the infantry as a machine gunner team. So like 2 people, one can be the loader, one can be the gunner. But usually these are informal and they're only really formally used in a few militaries.
Okay.
So above that, in the Indian Army is the section, which consists of 9 to 10 members, and it's known as a squad in the US military, and it's known as a section in any Commonwealth military. So it's led by an NCO. In many militaries, it's a corporal.
Okay.
Or a naik in the Indian context. But in our military, it's usually a havaldar. So after the section is the platoon, which has around 30 members. It consists of multiple sections. It's led by a commissioned officer. In the Indian Army, it's a lieutenant. In other Commonwealth militaries, it can also be a second lieutenant or a lieutenant.
Okay.
Since the second lieutenant rank doesn't exist here anymore, it's not used, of course. And the equivalent of a platoon in the armored corps is known as a troop.
Okay.
So it has around 3 tanks. So after that is the company, which consists of around 100 to 250 soldiers, depending on the country. It's led by a major. In some cases, if the military is short-staffed, it's led by a captain.
Okay.
But usually the captain is the second in command, or the 2IC. The equivalent of a company in the armored corps is known as a squadron. So a squadron has around 14 or 16 tanks.
Okay.
After the company or the squadron comes the battalion. and it's known as a battalion in the infantry, but it's known by other terms in other arms. So in the artillery, in the engineers, or in the armored corps, it's known as a regiment. So in a battalion, now battalions in the Indian Army, they consist of usually around 900 troops, in the armored corps around 42 tanks.
Right.
But it used to be a smaller number, so 600 to 750 troops earlier. Used to be commanded by a lieutenant colonel, but now it's the rank of colonel in the Indian Army. But in other militaries, it's still lieutenant colonel. So in the armored corps, the commanding officer of a regiment is known as a commandant, who again holds the rank of colonel. So that though there are some differences in terminology depending on the arm. And this may confuse some because regiments in the infantry are much larger, mostly ceremonial terms. So they're organizations drawing from a common community, recruiting from a common community in India. Although, of course, the officers don't necessarily have to belong to that community.
Correct.
But in the infantry, regiments are mainly ceremonial. But in the armored corps, in the artillery, and in the engineers, regiments are the equivalents of the battalion. So that's
it is a little confusing, but I think that's
it is, yes.
just how it is.
And of course, in the US Army or in other armies, regiments are usually units that are larger than a battalion, that consist of two or four, 2 to 4 battalions. So the most famous example is the 75th Ranger Regiment that are quite notorious for being very combat effective.
Yeah,
so
that is true.
Yes.
I think it's interesting, although it's confusing, but I think it's important to understand these distinctions.
Yeah, there is quite a few variations depending on the nation.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the usual denominator in the Commonwealth is that regiments are ceremonial.
Correct.
Except in the cases I mentioned previously. So that concludes the units part.
Okay.
After this come the formations, which are groupings of battalions or higher.
Okay.
In the Indian Army, after the battalion comes the formation of a brigade, which consists of 3,000 to 5,000 soldiers.
Okay.
This is the case in most militaries. Although in the Austrian or Swiss case, they can go much higher. So, but yeah, usually the sizes are 3,000 to 5,000. Of course, these are commanded by the eponymous brigadiers.
Yeah.
And these consists of multiple battalions, and usually brigades are subordinate to divisions, but in some cases they are independent, so they will be known as independent brigades. So for example, the 50th Parachute Brigade, that's an independent brigade that functions independently, it carries out maneuvers independently, it is not subordinate to a division.
Okay.
So yeah, that's an example of an independent brigade, but usually brigades are subordinate.
All right.
They're subordinate to divisions. Divisions contain multiple brigades as well as a support element. So they'll usually be around 13,000, 15,000 plus the support element. They can go up to 20,000 certain militaries.
Wow.
And they're commanded by a major general. Another thing about the brigade part that I mentioned previously is that brigades in the US Army are usually commanded by colonels, because colonel is also considered a senior rank. So divisions are commanded by major generals, and like I said, they have around 13, 14, 15,000 soldiers plus the support element. And they, of course, in turn come under the command of corps. Corps are headed by lieutenant generals, and these corps usually cover a wide area, a wide geographical area, and they are almost the largest formation of a military. So a corps is considered huge. So it can have up to 50 or 60,000 soldiers even.
Wow.
So it contain multiple divisions. And after that comes the command, which is now being phased out. Commands are headed by senior lieutenant generals. They have, like we mentioned in the previous episode, they have 3 stars plus 2 oak leaves below them.
Correct.
So lieutenant generals had those corps, had those commands, and these commands are now being phased out in favor of combined theaters.
Okay.
So while commands were actually a formation that was used in all three branches of the armed forces, now these theaters will be combined, and these theaters will take over the functioning of these commands.
Okay.
And they'll have components from all three branches. So these theaters will gradually be introduced. This concept was initially introduced by the erstwhile Chief of Defence Staff, General Bipin Rawat.
Right.
And now this system will slowly be brought into functioning. We have an example of a combined arms command already in the form of the Andaman and Nicobar Command.
Right.
So under a 3-star officer, all three branches function. So that's how these theaters will work in the future. And of course, all these theaters come under the command of their respective armed forces. And all of these combined are under the chiefs.
So how many theaters is India expected to have?
3. And of course, earlier there used to be 4 for the 4 commands for the Air Force and the Army. But now there will only be 3 theaters because the Northern Command is expected to stay independent.
Okay.
Because of course there's no sea there, so there's no real point. A lot of administrative, organizational elements as well, such as the zones and the areas.
Okay.
But we won't get into that because it complicates things. But for the sake of simplicity, that's the basic command. That's the basic combat component of our armed forces. So the commands have their equivalents in the Air Force and the Navy as well. They have the air commands and the naval commands. The training command. And that sums it up.
Of course. Great. So I think just like we discussed in the previous episode, there are a lot of changes that we're actually undergoing. So we expect these things to change and evolve, hopefully that will become a new episode sometime to understand how theaterization is working and what India is moving towards. A lot of Indianization of, as we call, there's change in ranks in the way that we are in the way even traditions are changing now, in terms of indigenization of everything. So great. I think, Sohraab, that was a great explanation and a good breakdown of, how our forces are structured, especially the Indian Army. And we'll get back to you in the next session as well and hopefully discuss a few more things.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.